The melody fractured, a record skipping on the turntable of the night. One heartbeat, the frenetic pulse of the samba hammered in my chest. A vibrant, almost painful joy. The next, utter stillness. Not a gradual quieting, but a sudden, violent severing as if some unseen hand had strangled the sound. The revelers, a living tapestry woven with feathers and sweat-slicked skin, stilled too, caught mid-stride, mid-laugh, mid-embrace. A vacuum descended, a tangible absence that pressed against my eardrums. It wasn't just quiet, it was a pregnant hush, a sensation of something immense and malevolent holding its breath. I recall a whisper of premonition, a cold tendril snaking its way up my spine, a feeling utterly out of sync with the riotous abandon I sought in this faraway land. An ancient dread, vast and unknowable. I had journeyed to Rio for catharsis, for the blessed oblivion of anonymity, for the raw, unrestrained ecstasy of letting go. Now, a gnawing disquiet gnawed at the base of my skull, a sensation akin to being scrutinized by a presence both primeval and predatory. Then, a solitary thud, a lone drumbeat cleaved the silence. Measured and weighty, it reverberated across the plaza, amplified by the unnerving quietude. And I could swear it resonated not just in my ears, but deep within my marrow. A ripple of unease stirred the crowd, a low murmur that quickly died, and the music stammered back to life, hesitant and tentative. The joy was a counterfeit now, a desperate charade, a frantic attempt to resurrect what had been lost, what had been tainted. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to retreat to the sterile safety of my hotel room, to bury myself beneath the crisp white sheets. Yet, my limbs were leaden, my feet anchored to the cobblestones. An invisible force kept me pinned, a silent command I dared not disobey. I couldn't articulate it, but a certainty, as icy as a tomb, washed over me. The world had tilted on its axis. Reality itself had subtly, irrevocably been altered. And the genesis of this change was bound to that silence, to that ominous drumbeat, to the unsettling fact that everyone around me seemed determined to ignore it, to pretend that the cosmic hiccup hadn't occurred. A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, a fleeting glimpse of something not quite human, and then it was gone. But the icy finger tracing my spine remained, a promise of things to come, and the knowledge that I was now caught in a game with rules I didn't understand, and stakes far higher than I could possibly imagine. I needed answers, but where to find them in this city of secrets? I was Ben Carter, escape artist, except the prison was my own life. Ohio, with its cornfields and crippling predictability, had become a cage. I'd flown to Rio desperate to rattle the bars, breathe fire, taste life before it ossified completely. Accountant wasn't just a job, it was a sentence. Isabella was the pardon I craved. She moved like liquid sunshine, a stark contrast to the dull ache in my soul. Her laughter was a melody I'd never heard in Ohio, a song of pure, unadulterated joy. Married, she'd admitted, to a man named Rafael. A sorcerer, she'd joked, but the tremor in her voice, the way she glanced away, suggested the punchline wasn't entirely a joke. I should have bolted then, grabbed the first flight back to Cleveland and buried myself in spreadsheets. Sanity screamed, but something stronger, something reckless and starved for beauty, kept me rooted. Each stolen moment with her felt like borrowed time, a precarious dance on the edge of a volcano. And then, the silences. The world would simply stop. Sound vanished. The background noise of the city, the relentless rhythm of carnival, choked off as if someone had thrown a switch. It wasn't a gradual fading, but an abrupt, jarring cessation. My ears would ring, a high-pitched whine that seemed to burrow into my skull. The first time, I'd chalked it up to too much caipirinha. The second, a glitch in the matrix, a bizarre but harmless anomaly. But they kept happening, each time lasting a fraction longer, each time leaving me more shaken. I'd look around, expecting to see others reacting, a shared confusion on their faces. But they didn't. People laughed, talked, drank, oblivious. They just went on as if time hadn't paused and taken a dark breath. Except Isabella. Once, on Copacabana Beach, the silence descended like a shroud. I saw pure, unadulterated terror flash in her eyes, a raw, primal fear she couldn't quite mask before plastering on a smile. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She shook her head, too quickly, too forcefully. "Hear what, Ben? The waves? The music? The silence, Isabella?" Her smile wavered. "Maybe you're just tired, Querido. Carnival is exhausting, no?" But I saw the truth in her eyes, a reflection of the fear that was slowly consuming me. She knew about the silences. She knew what they meant. And I had a sickening feeling that it all circled back to her husband, Rafael. A man she described as a sorcerer with a nervous laugh. A man who possessed her in ways I couldn't begin to fathom. The summons arrived on a sliver of dark wood, like a splinter from a coffin. A child, gaunt and silent as a scarecrow, materialized at my door, pressed the card into my hand, and dissolved back into the Rio heat, before I could manage a muto obrigado. "Simply Ben," the card declared, in a script that seemed to writhe on the surface like disturbed worms, inviting me to Rafael's house. A carnival celebration, it proclaimed. Isabella had hinted at such a gathering, but this felt wrong. Clandestine, like a secret whispered in a crowded room. I showed it to her the next day, the wood cold against my palm. Her reaction was immediate, a flare of panic in her dark eyes. "Don't go, Ben," she hissed, her voice barely audible above the city's perpetual roar. "Rafael, he's not a good man." I pressed, desperate for details, but she clamped shut, her lips a tight, bloodless line. "Just, please, Ben, stay away." Of course I ignored her. A moth to a flame, a lemming to the cliff's edge. My desire for her, a raw, aching thing, overrode every instinct for self-preservation. The house squatted in a forgotten corner of the city, far removed from the seductive pulse of Copacabana. It was small, unremarkable from the outside, but stepping inside was like entering another dimension. The air hung thick and heavy, saturated with the cloying sweetness of incense and something else, something sharp and metallic, like old blood. Masks leered from the walls, their painted smiles twisted and malevolent. Statues of grotesque deities stood in shadowed corners, their obsidian eyes seeming to follow my every move. Feathers, bones, and other unidentifiable objects cluttered every surface, a testament to Rafael's interests. He greeted me with a smile that didn't warm his eyes, a smile that felt practiced, predatory. Tall and lean, with a gaze that could bore holes through steel, he exuded an unsettling charisma. "Ben," he purred, his English flawless, with only a trace of an accent. "Isabella speaks of you often." He ushered me into the main room, where a handful of people milled about, their laughter brittle and forced. Isabella was there, luminous in a simple white dress, her eyes darting nervously between Rafael and me. A trapped bird. The party itself was a charade. Rafael shadowed my every move, his presence a suffocating weight. Drinks flowed freely, but the conversations remained superficial, guarded. His eyes, black and bottomless, felt like a brand, searing into my skin. As the night deepened, a shift occurred. The forced gaiety evaporated, replaced by a palpable tension. Rafael, with a theatrical flourish, announced a ceremony. He began to chant in a language that scraped against my ears, a guttural tongue that sounded ancient and profane. He brandished a feathered staff, its tip adorned with what looked suspiciously like a human skull. Then he sprinkled something into a small fire, a coarse yellow powder that smelled like sulfur and decay. The flames erupted, casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls, transforming the room into a charnel house. The air grew heavy, vibrating with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end. And then, the silence descended, thicker and more suffocating than ever before. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else, something vast and unknowable, pressing down on us, stealing the air from our lungs. Time seemed to warp and bend, stretching into an eternity. The music returned, but it was different now. Darker, more primal. The samba rhythms twisted into something unsettling. Something that resonated with the fear clawing at my insides. Rafael turned to me, his eyes gleaming with an unholy light. His lips peeled back in a slow, deliberate smile, a smile that promised pain and damnation. And in that moment, as his gaze locked onto mine, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the very core, that accepting that invitation had been a colossal, catastrophic mistake, the kind that rewrites your destiny in blood. The mattress had become a torture device, each spring a tiny, malevolent imp poking at my ribs. Sleep was a battlefield. Rafael's grinning face, the enemy commander. The silence. God, that silence was a cancer, spreading through the noise of the city, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness I blundered into. It was like living inside a broken radio. The static a prelude to something awful. Isabella was a ghost of herself. Her eyes, once bright with mischief, were now haunted pools, reflecting a terror she wouldn't name. She flinched at shadows, jumped at sudden noises, and avoided my gaze like I was carrying a plague. Talking to her was like trying to pull teeth from a shark, painful and ultimately futile. I became a digital grave robber, digging through the internet, desperate for any scrap of information about Rafael. He was a pillar of the community, a local celebrity, a healer, a spiritual advisor. Glowing profiles painted him as a benevolent saint. Then came the whispers, the online shadows, rumors of curses, pacts with unseen entities, rituals performed under the light of a blood moon. The more I unearthed, the deeper the pit in my stomach grew. I haunted the musty back alleys of Rio's bookstores, searching for answers in crumbling pages. The air in one shop smelled of old paper and secrets, and the owner, a woman who looked as ancient and knowing as the pyramids, seemed to see right through me. Her eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, held a wisdom that bordered on the unsettling. She led me through a labyrinth of shelves, to a dark corner where the dust motes danced like restless spirits. "Careful with this," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Some doors are better left unopened." The book was bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with grotesque symbols and diagrams that seemed to writhe before my eyes. The script was alien, indecipherable. Then I saw it. A drawing of Rafael, his face contorted in ritualistic fervor, performing the exact ceremony I'd witnessed in his house. And beside it, a chilling description of a curse. A curse designed to punish infidelity, to shatter the soul of anyone who dared to betray the sacred bonds of love. A fist of ice clenched my heart. Rafael had cursed me. It wasn't a hunch, not a suspicion. It was a cold, hard certainty that settled in my bones. But why? Was Isabella the only reason? Or was I a pawn in something larger, something more sinister? I had to know. I had to find a way to break the curse before it devoured me whole. That night, sleep offered no escape. I was lost in a forest of nightmares, the trees skeletal and clawing. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay. A voice, whisper thin and laced with static, called my name. It was Isabella's voice, but twisted, corrupted, like a recording played backward. "Help me, Ben," it hissed. "He's going to kill me." I jolted awake, soaked in sweat, my pulse hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The dream felt real, too real. A premonition, perhaps, or a warning. I couldn't stand by and watch Rafael destroy her. And me, I had to fight back, even if it meant facing the devil himself. A new sound joined the symphony of dread. Scratching. It came from inside the walls. A frantic, desperate scrabbling that made my teeth ache. It started low, almost imperceptible, then grew louder, closer, until it felt like something was trying to claw its way into my room. I grabbed a chair, my knuckles white, my breath caught in my throat. The scratching intensified, then stopped abruptly. Silence. A silence even more terrifying than before. Then, a single wet thump against the wall, followed by a slow, oozing drip. I didn't need to see what it was. I knew. Something was inside the walls, and it was getting closer. I charged toward Rafael's lair, the Ohio accountant's shed, replaced by a man driven by something akin to madness. The afternoon sun beat down, turning the Rio streets into shimmering ovens, but the chill inside me had nothing to do with the weather. It was the icy dread of knowing I was walking into a trap. He opened the door before I even touched the warped wood, his face smooth, almost serene. But those eyes, those obsidian chips, held a universe of darkness. "Ben," he said, his voice a low, almost musical drone. "Come to confess." The curse I spat, the word tasting like ash. "Why Rafael? Why me?" He didn't flinch, didn't deny a thing. Just those eyes, boring into mine, dissecting me. "You trespassed," he said, each word a precise cut. "You defiled what was mine. Isabella's affection, my home's sanctity. Suffering is the only fitting recompense." "She doesn't love you," I blurted, my voice cracking. "She fears you. There's a difference." He laughed then, a sound that scraped against my soul. Like fingernails on a chalkboard, amplified by the silence that always seemed to follow him. "Love is a delusion, Ben. A weakness. Fear, however, fear is a tool, a lever. And I, my friend, am a master craftsman." He raised his hand, a slow, deliberate gesture. It wasn't a fist, not a threat in the conventional sense. It was something else, something far more insidious. A conductor raising his baton to unleash a symphony of pain. The pain exploded in my chest. Not a dull ache, not a stabbing throb. It was a white-hot agony, a sensation of my heart being crushed in a vice, twisted by unseen hands. I gasped, stumbled backward, clutching at my shirt. "A mere prelude," he said, his voice now a silken whisper, laced with venom. "A taste of the torments to come. You will know despair, Ben. You will crawl through darkness. You will beg for release." He slammed the door, the sound echoing like a death knell. I staggered back toward the hotel, each breath a searing torment. It wasn't just physical. The pain was burrowing into my mind, twisting my thoughts, poisoning my soul. I knew with a bone-deep certainty that this wasn't some simple hex. This was something profound, something ancient, unleashed by a man who reveled in cruelty. He wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not until I was broken, until I was reduced to a whimpering husk. The hotel room was a sanctuary no longer, but a cage. The mirror reflected a stranger, pale, gaunt, eyes bloodshot, and wide with terror. I looked like a corpse, a walking dead man, and that's how I felt. The curse wasn't just attacking my body. It was dismantling my very being, eroding my sanity, turning me into a shadow of my former self. How did one fight a sorcerer? How did an accountant from Ohio break a curse woven from shadows and whispered words? I was out of my depth, drowning in a sea of black magic, a minnow facing a leviathan. But surrender wasn't an option. Not while Isabella was still in his clutches. Not while there was even a flicker of hope left. I would fight, even if it meant facing the darkest corners of my own soul. The scratching had returned, louder now, more insistent. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. The room felt like a coffin, and whatever was inside was determined to get out. Or get in. A rat scurried across the floor, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence. It paused, stared at me, then let out a high-pitched squeal that seemed to echo the torment in my own heart. The squeal morphed into a whisper, a voice that sounded eerily like Rafael's. "You cannot win, Ben," it hissed. "Your fear is my weapon." The rat vanished into a crack in the wall, leaving me alone in the suffocating darkness. The scratching growing louder, closer, a symphony of terror conducted by a madman. I was losing myself. But even as the darkness closed in, a spark of defiance remained. A stubborn refusal to surrender. I would not break. I would not beg. Not yet. The city, once a kaleidoscope of vibrant hues, was now leached of its color. A faded photograph of joy. The samba, that infectious heartbeat, stuttered and died in my ears, replaced by a discordant drone, a low, humming dread that resonated deep within my bones. The crowds, once a swirling mass of humanity, regarded me with suspicion, their eyes like chips of ice, following me with a predatory hunger. I was an anomaly, an outcast, marked by some unseen brand, some invisible stain that repelled the light. My pockets felt lighter, then empty. A pickpocket, slick as an eel, relieved me of my wallet in a crowded marketplace. My credit cards, once reliable lifelines, were declined with cold, mechanical indifference. I was forced to abandon my comfortable hotel, trading crisp linen for threadbare sheets in a squalid room far from the glittering beaches, a place where the air hung thick with the stench of decay and desperation. The food tasted like ash, each bite a reminder of my dwindling hope. Every breath was a struggle, the air itself heavy with a sense of impending doom, a suffocating dread that clung to me like a shroud. Isabella had vanished. I haunted the streets, a ghost searching for a lost soul. But she was nowhere to be found. I went to her house, my heart pounding with a desperate hope, only to be met by Rafael's cold, contemptuous gaze. He stood in the doorway, a sentinel guarding his prize, his eyes pools of black ice. "She doesn't want to see you," he sneered, his voice a silken threat. "Leave her alone, gringo, before you regret it." I didn't believe him. I knew she was a prisoner, trapped in his web of darkness, her spirit slowly being consumed by his malevolent power. But I was powerless, a fly caught in a spider's web, unable to break free. The nights were a descent into madness. Nightmares clawed at my sanity, visions of grotesque figures chanting in shadows, their faces obscured by masks of bone and feathers. Isabella's face haunted me, contorted in terror, her eyes pleading for release. I would wake screaming, the sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of bile burning in my throat. Sanity was slipping away, replaced by a growing certainty that I was losing my mind, one terrifying fragment at a time. The curse was working. It was isolating me, dismantling me, stripping away everything I held dear, leaving me naked and vulnerable to the darkness. Escape beckoned, the siren song of retreat whispering in my ear. "Run, Ben, run. Cut your losses, crawl back to Ohio, bury yourself in spreadsheets, and pretend this never happened." But I couldn't. I couldn't abandon Isabella to that monster. I had to try, even if it meant sacrificing everything, even if it meant staring into the abyss and finding nothing staring back. The old woman at the bookstore was my last hope. I returned, the book clutched in my trembling hands, the pages stained with sweat and fear. I pointed to the description of the curse, the chilling words that had become a constant echo in my mind. "Can you help me?" I pleaded, my voice raw with desperation. "Is there any way to break it? To stop him?" She studied the book, her face etched with worry, the lines deepening like cracks in ancient stone. "This is a powerful curse," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It will not be easily undone. You need someone with strong magic, someone who can stand against Rafael's power. Do you know anyone?" I asked, hope flickering like a dying ember. She hesitated, her eyes clouded with doubt, then nodded slowly. "There is an old woman who lives in the favelas," she said, her voice hushed. "They call her Man Maria. Some say she possesses great power, but be warned, she is not easy to find, and she does not offer her help to everyone. She sees into the heart and judges accordingly." I thanked her, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. This was it, my last chance, the final roll of the dice. If Man Maria couldn't help me, I was doomed. The shadows deepened, the scratching grew louder, and the city held its breath, waiting for the darkness to consume me. The kid was a shadow in the sun-baked maze, a skinny scrap of a thing with eyes too big for his face. He looked like he'd swallowed a secret he couldn't quite digest. He'd latched onto me like a burr, sensing my desperation, my lost dog aura in this festering labyrinth of shacks and despair. He'd seen the fear, the raw, exposed nerve that the glittering skyscrapers of Copacabana pretended didn't exist. "Man Maria lives here," he'd rasped, pointing a dirt-caked finger at a shack that looked like a strong wind would flatten it into kindling. "Be careful. She's different." Different was an understatement. The air around the shack shimmered, warped, like heat, rising off asphalt but colder. A palpable chill that seeped into your bones. I knocked, a tentative rap that felt like a violation. The door groaned open, revealing a crone, her face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by sun and sorrow. Her eyes were milky, filmed over with age, but they burned, those eyes. They saw too much, knew too much. "You seek," she croaked, her voice like gravel gargling with rust. "I know what crawls in your shadow." I spilled it all, the whole sordid mess. The carnival, Isabella, Rafael's curse, the scratching in the walls that still echoed in my head. She listened, her gaze unwavering, a spider assessing a fly caught in its web. When I finished, she nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that creaked her ancient bones. "I can cut the cord," she said, "but the price, always a price." My stomach churned. I'd suspected as much. Nothing was free, especially not in this world. The Shadowland where the veil between realities was thin enough to tear. What kind of price? Her milky eyes seemed to bore into me, searching. Something you cherish, something that bleeds when you cut it loose. My family, my threadbare career back in Ohio, they felt distant, irrelevant, pale imitations of real life. Then it hit me, a sledgehammer blow to the gut. "Isabella," I choked out, the word a ragged sob. I'll leave her. Vanish. Never see her again." Maria's expression didn't change. No sympathy, no judgment. Just a bleak acceptance. "The bargain is struck, but Rafael, he's woven deep. This may not be enough. And even if it is, the wound will fester. You will carry the scar." She led me inside the shack. A sensory assault of dried herbs, flickering candles, and the hollow stares of animal skulls. Feathers, black as sin, hung from the ceiling like macabre ornaments. She lit a fire in a small brazier, the flames casting dancing shadows that transformed the room into a fever dream. Then, she began to chant, a guttural incantation that vibrated in my teeth, a language that felt older than time itself. The air thickened, became charged with an energy that prickled my skin, 1,000 invisible needles digging into my flesh. The chanting intensified, rising to a crescendo that threatened to shatter my skull. The fire flared, casting grotesque shadows that writhed on the walls like demons unleashed. Then, the silence, deeper, more absolute than anything I'd ever experienced. It was a vacuum, a black hole sucking the very life out of the room. A lance of pain pierced my chest, the familiar agony of Rafael's curse, but amplified, twisted into something far more agonizing. It felt like something was being ripped from me, torn from my soul, leaving a gaping, bleeding wound. I screamed, a primal howl of anguish that echoed through the favela. And then, nothing. Blackness. Oblivion. I awoke on the dirt floor, the taste of bile burning in my throat. Maria stood over me, her face ashen, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and something else. "Fear? He's done," she rasped, her voice even weaker than before. "The cord is severed, but you must flee, gringo. Flee Rio. Never return. Rafael, he will seek vengeance, even beyond the veil." I nodded, my body trembling, every muscle screaming in protest. I staggered to my feet, stumbled out of the shack, into the blinding sunlight. The world seemed sharper, clearer, yet hollow, empty. The pain in my chest had subsided, but a deeper ache remained, the phantom limb of a love lost, a connection severed. I walked back to the hotel, a zombie on autopilot, packed my meager belongings, and booked the first flight out of Rio. As the plane ascended, I looked down at the city, the glittering lights of Copacabana receding into the distance. A beautiful lie. I knew I'd never forget Rio, never forget Isabella, and I'd never escape the scar. The psychic wound that Rafael and Maria had carved into my soul. I bought my freedom, but at what cost? And deep down, a chilling premonition whispered that the bill was not yet fully paid. He tasted iron, not the metaphorical kind. The coppery tang of real blood welling from a split lip. The square swam, the vibrant colors of the possessed whirling into a nauseating vortex. He'd charged like a fool, a broken-down knight tilting at a windmill powered by black magic. Now the pavement was a cold comfort, pressing against his cheek as Rafael's voice, amplified by something unholy, boomed. "The prodigal returns. Did you truly believe your pathetic sacrifice bought you sanctuary, gringo? The threads of fate are not so easily severed. Each word was a hammer blow, each syllable a fresh wave of agony radiating from his chest. The curse, dormant but never truly extinguished, flared back to life, a burning brand searing his insides. He tried to rise, to fight, but his limbs were leaden, unresponsive. He was a puppet, and Rafael held the strings. The chanting escalated, a guttural drone that resonated with the tremor in the earth. The sky, once a brilliant blue, curdled into a bruised purple, then a suffocating black. The air crackled with static, the ozone smell sharp in his nostrils. This wasn't just a curse, it was a summoning. Rafael was calling something else down. Then, through the swirling chaos, he saw her. Isabella. She stood behind Rafael, a ghost in the inferno. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollowed. But even in that ravaged state, the beauty that had ensnared him still flickered. But it was a beauty laced with terror, a desperate plea etched on her face. She was a prisoner, a puppet of a different kind, and Rafael was tightening his grip. In her hand, she held a knife, a cheap, serrated thing, the kind you'd use to slice bread. But in that moment, it was the only weapon against the encroaching darkness. Her hand trembled, the blade glinting in the unnatural light. He could see the internal battle raging within her, the desperate struggle for control. Their eyes met, a fleeting connection across the chasm of fear and despair. He saw the love that had once burned so brightly, now flickering like a dying candle in a hurricane. He also saw the resolve, the desperate, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she could still break free. Then, she lunged. A desperate, reckless act of defiance. A scream tore from her throat, a sound swallowed by the chanting and the roaring wind. But he heard it. He heard the echo of her soul, screaming for release. The knife flashed, a silver streak against the black. Time twisted, stretched, then snapped. The shriek vanished, devoured by the mob's roar, a single united exhalation that tore through the plaza like a rogue wave. It played out like a broken film reel. Isabella's arm, the knife's reflection catching the dying light, Rafael's visage of utter shock as the blade rammed into his spine. He stumbled, eyes bulging, disbelief plastered across his features like cheap makeup. The chanting choked off. The earth stopped its tremors. The oppressive sky lightened, revealing the approaching dawn like a grim promise. Rafael slumped, a dark stain blooming around him on the ancient cobblestones. Isabella stood above him, trembling violently, the knife still clutched in her white-knuckled fist. The throng fell silent, paralyzed. Then, a low hum began to build, a rising tide of dread and bewilderment. He scrambled to his feet, every muscle screaming, his mind a scrambled mess of fear and adrenaline. He lurched toward Isabella, pried the knife from her grip, and wrapped his arms around her. "Are you hurt?" he managed, his voice shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I had no choice," she stammered. He was going to destroy everything. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, their flashing lights painting the scene in grotesque shades of red and blue. The police arrived in force, a phalanx of grim faces and drawn weapons. They wrestled Isabella into custody, her face pale, her gaze vacant. He tried to explain, to make them understand what had happened, the darkness they had faced, but his words were lost in the chaos. They dismissed him as a madman, a delusional tourist caught in a nightmare he couldn't comprehend. They cuffed him too, shoved him into the back of a paddy wagon, and hauled him away to a small, reeking cell. The next days bled into each other, a blur of interrogation rooms, accusations, and despair. He was grilled, badgered, accused of crimes he didn't commit. But none of it mattered. He knew he'd done what he had to do. He'd saved Isabella. He'd stopped Rafael. Eventually they released him, citing insufficient evidence. They escorted him to the airport and put him on the first flight back to Ohio, a pariah banished from paradise. He left Rio with a leaden heart, but also with a strange sense of closure. He'd confronted his demons, stared into the abyss. and somehow survived. But the scars remained, festering beneath the surface. The memories haunted his waking hours, twisting his dreams into grotesque parodies of reality. He knew he would never be the same. Back in Ohio, he tried to pick up the pieces of a shattered life. He returned to his job, his routine. But the world felt alien, distorted. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows flickered at the periphery of his vision. Whispers carried on the wind seemed to call his name. He knew Rafael was dead, buried beneath the soil of Rio, but his presence lingered, a malevolent echo resonating in the emptiness of his soul. The curse, though broken, had left its mark, a permanent stain on his psyche. He started drinking, a slow, deliberate descent into oblivion. Whiskey became his only solace, a temporary shield against the encroaching darkness. He isolated himself, pushing away friends and family, retreating into a self-imposed exile. He was drowning, slowly but surely, in a sea of despair. One night, as he sat alone in his darkened apartment, nursing a bottle of cheap whiskey, a knock echoed through the silence. He hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the door. Standing there, bathed in the pale glow of the hallway light, was Isabella. She was a Xerox of the woman he'd loved, faded and smudged around the edges. The joy was gone, replaced by a granite hardness that chilled him more than the Ohio winter seeping through the ill-fitting windows. "Then," she said, her voice a flat, effectless monotone, "I need assistance." He let her shuffle inside, the scent of cheap cigarettes and desperation clinging to her like a shroud. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drummer boy announcing the arrival of doom. She narrated her life post-Rio, each sentence a nail hammered into the coffin of their past. The police had released her, yes, but the court of public opinion was a far more brutal judge. They held her responsible for Rafael's demise, for the unrestrained terror that had followed like a rabid dog. Her life had imploded. Home, friends, that spark of incandescent joy, all reduced to ashes. She was adrift, a ghost ship sailing a sea of sorrow. "I came because you'd understand," she rasped, her gaze avoiding his. "You wouldn't pass judgment." He studied her, a grim mosaic of empathy and lingering desire swirling within him. He yearned to shield her, to rewind time and erase the horrors they'd endured. But the past was a pitiless beast, its teeth sunk deep into their flesh. There was no going back. They were both damaged goods, irrevocably tainted. "I'm lost, Ben," she whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. "I don't know what to do." He grasped her hand, her fingers cold and brittle. "We'll navigate this," he vowed, the words hollow even to his own ears. "Together, we'll find a path." The ensuing months were a grim dance of normalcy. A cramped apartment above a laundromat, dead-end jobs with soul-crushing supervisors, a desperate attempt to construct a life from the rubble of their past. But the shadows were relentless, stretching long and menacing in the twilight, a perpetual reminder of the nightmare they shared. Then, the sleepless nights began, filled with eerie whispers and the feeling of being watched. One night, he awoke to find Isabella looming over him, her eyes wide, reflecting the terror that had become her constant companion. "He's here, Ben," she gasped, her breath ragged. "Rafael is here." He bolted upright, his heart a frantic drum solo. The room was cloaked in shadow, but there was nothing there. "What are you babbling about?" he demanded, his voice hoarse with sleep and apprehension. "He's inside my head," she declared, her voice rising in pitch. "Controlling me." Doubt warred with dread. Was she losing her grip? Was the trauma fracturing her mind? Or was Rafael somehow still alive, a malevolent echo seeking vengeance from beyond the grave? Then, her eyes altered. The warmth faded, replaced by a glacial emptiness. Her voice deepened, taking on a gravelly rasp that sent shivers down his spine. "Greetings, Ben," she purred, the voice undeniably Rafael's. "Did you honestly believe you could escape my grasp?" The horrifying truth slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. Rafael hadn't vanished. He was still present, a parasitic entity inhabiting Isabella, manipulating her like a twisted marionette. The curse hadn't been broken, only transferred, morphing into a new, even more terrifying form. And now, he was going to exploit Isabella to inflict his final crushing revenge. She pounced, her hands outstretched, her face contorted with a hatred that wasn't her own. He scrambled back, trying to defend himself. But she was too strong, too quick, fueled by Rafael's dark power. She shoved him against the wall, pinning him with unnatural strength. "It ends here, Ben," she growled, Rafael's voice dripping with malevolence. "Prepare to atone for your transgressions." She raised her hand, a knife shimmering in the moonlight, its edge honed to a razor sharpness. He closed his eyes, anticipating the inevitable plunge, the agonizing release of death. But it didn't come. Instead, a scream, raw and piercing, filled the apartment. A sound of unbearable anguish and torment. He opened his eyes. Isabella stood over him, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The knife trembled in her grip, her knuckles white with the effort of resisting. "I can't," she whimpered, her voice a mere thread. "I can't murder you." She dropped the knife, collapsing to the floor, her body racked with uncontrollable sobs. He rose unsteadily, cradled her in his arms. "It's over," he whispered, the words a pathetic lie. He's gone. But he knew the truth. Rafael was still there, lurking in the depths of Isabella's mind, patiently awaiting his opportunity to resurface. The curse was an unseverable chain, binding them together in a macabre dance of torment and despair. They were trapped, condemned to relive the horrors of the past, forever haunted by the ghosts of their actions. And as he held Isabella, feeling the tremors of her sobs, he understood that the true horror had just commenced. The curse was not an external entity. It was the guilt and the pain that they had caused, a dark mark in their souls. Years later, Ben, a withered husk of his former self, would find an old wooden card in his pocket. On it, a carving of a carnival mask. He would stare at it, then he would laugh, and his heart would stop.